chain. And we are delighted to have you here this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're logging in from. We are having the first of a series of online events that we're promoting under our supply chain enabled banner. At Performance, we're a niche supply chain consultancy provider, and we're proud participants in the global supply chain, which extends from source to customer and in an increasingly circular world back to source again. Supply chain enabled as a theme is a recognition of the critical role supply chains play in keeping product on the shelves, keeping us fed, keeping us healthy, and ultimately doing so in a more sustainable manner as we look to the future. I'm sure we'll all agree it's been an extraordinary last 10 months. We're all adapting to new ways of doing things, so hence we are here digitally. And in our first webinar, we're discussing one of the key linkages to our customers through the retail channel. And I'm delighted to have Carol Spieckerman, who's president of Spieckerman Retail, join us for this session. So welcome, Carol. And before, Carol, I sort of give the accolades and you start to blush or whatever else, I'll work through just sort of a couple of logistical points for the session. First logistical point is me figuring out to get the a presentation visible to folks. And you're all, as I say, very, very welcome to the session. And we're delighted that you've given your time to be able to join us. And while logistically we have to have attendees on mute, we want to make sure that you can actually join the conversation and be with us. So there is a Q&A mode on the platform, and you should see on the bottom right-hand side of your screens a blue question mark icon in the chat box. So if you do have a question to ask, if you can click on that question mark icon and just type your question, that'll become visible to us. If at any stage as well, if you're having technical issues, click on the same icon, and hopefully one of our team will be able to help you with that. So I say we're delighted to have you here, and delighted really as well to have Carol be part of this. I met Carol just over 10 years ago. Yes, we are that old, surprisingly. And we're both engaged by a mutual client to figure out how supply chain and retail could work better together to collaborate to make sure there was increased visibility or increased availability of product on the shelves. And how do you actually use the combination of both of those to drive additional volumes and sales through retail? And what I'll say about Carol is, and I'll say it in the nicest possible way, is at the time, Carol was as obsessed by and immersed in the world of retail as I was in the world of supply chain. And I absolutely admired her for that and continue to follow her insights and trajectories on the retail world. And she's very much the go-to person in my book for what's happening in the minds and in the worlds of retailers. Carol is president of Spieckerman Retail, and she's an author. She's an advisor to a lot of the leading retailers and the brands that you will know. She's also an advisor to a lot of the brands looking to do business with those retailers and providers in that space. Her retail insights and trajectories are much sought after, much published, both in industry publications and the larger business publications. And for those of you who are into your podcasts, I think we nearly all are at this stage, she's also launched a very successful podcast, which is Spieckerman Speaks Retail. So I'm going to hand over to Carol now. Carol's has delightfully agreed to give us maybe 20 minutes or so of an overview on some of the key retail trajectories, and then we'll join for a Q&A session and discussion around those trajectories. We'll try and keep it to around 45 minutes in total to be respectful of your time. So we'll try and get through as many of your questions as you can. So Carol, delighted to have you with us. Great to see you again, even though virtually. And I'll hand the banner over to yourself.
Thank you so much, Lorcan. It's really great to be with you again and to reconnect for this event. I'm really excited about it. And I want to welcome all the diverse retail stakeholders who are listening in, and particularly you supply chain experts. After I finish sharing my insights, I'm really looking forward to listening and learning from you guys. So Welcome to the retail revolution. I mean, if you haven't noticed, there is a revolution going on in retail right now. It's in full swing, and acts of rebellion are everywhere. I mean, you've got retailers on one hand shuttering hundreds or even thousands of stores, but some are opening hundreds and thousands more. They're cutting headcount, but they're also bringing in new faces and creating new roles that you've never seen in retail. They're doubling down on digital along with shoppers, but they're also bringing some new tricks to their bricks. And even more revolutionary, probably, is the way that they're partnering with one another for shop and shops, for marketplace partnerships, and so much more. You could even say that retailers are becoming newfound frenemies because they're doing so many of these partnerships and nothing is off the table, including hooking up with one another for all kinds of opportunities. But retailers are doing this, and none of this would be possible if they hadn't made a huge mind shift. They get it now that those old ways that have defined retail, in some cases for decades, are just not going to secure their future. So they're no longer holding on for dear life and longing for those good old days when things moved a lot slower and things were a lot more predictable. Now, a big takeaway here, though, is that a lot of these dynamics that we're going to talk about were very much at work before the COVID crisis. So you can think of COVID as being more of an accelerator for a lot of these dynamics that were going to be inevitable anyway. But one major shift underpins everything we're going to talk about. A simple fact: retailers are no longer just places that sell stuff, and brand marketers can no longer afford to act like companies that just sell stuff to retailers. Because retailers are starting to look and act and operate a lot more like those lean, agile technology platforms that they've been modeling their businesses after, that they've been partnering with, and increasingly even acquiring. Now, and these platforms now tie together so much more than before. Big data, content, partnerships, acquisitions, new formats, and so much more. So the game changer on the table is to really lean into your platform leverage if you're a retailer or a supplier. And if you're a supplier selling to retailers, to think in terms of positioning to retailers' platforms, not just selling stuff. And of course, opening up to the power of those platform partnerships that are going to be driving retail forward. And that's for everybody. So that's my business, really, and it's my passion, is helping all these diverse retail stakeholders that now have a role in retail, helping you perfect your platform positioning so that you can take advantage of this newfound openness to partnerships and collaborations, and ones that have never happened before. But today, our focus really is going to be on the why of retail and the real reasons why things are happening the way they are right now. And just as importantly, how those things are connected. Now, the way I get to this why of retail is through my retail trajectories. These are coordinates that I'm constantly creating, connecting, and mapping across all kinds of categories, borders, business models, and touch points. It's where all the insights that I'm tracking on behalf of my clients roll up. And it's also my alternative to trends, because my philosophy is, as fast as things are moving in retail right now, once something becomes a trend, it's usually too late. And besides, trend watching can have you chasing after what everybody else is chasing, even if it doesn't make sense for your business. So today we're going to blaze through 10 trajectories in the time that we have together, 10 trajectories that are triggering this latest retail revolution. We're going to move really fast, and we're also going to talk about how these trajectories impact your strategy wherever you sit in retail, and particularly for those of you who work with retailers. Now, we are going to have a great discussion afterwards, as well, as Lorcan mentioned. So please write down your questions and ideas that you want to share. I really want to hear from you when we wrap up. Now, something that doesn't get talked about enough as we start our insights for the day, what often gets left out of the equation is how this revolutionary change is impacting retailer organizations. Now, I'm taking it on first because it really is a seismic shift within the retailer organizations themselves. And this has a huge impact on anyone who does business with retailers, or just the entire retail landscape in general. But the bottom line is, back when retailers were pretty cookie cutter and everybody was doing the same thing and their organizations looked the same from one to the next, it was a lot easier because you could just develop a proposition and sort of lather, rinse, repeat. And it was easier for retailers too. But now, no two retail organizations look the same, and everything is completely unique. And on top of that, Retail HQ has become very diverse. There are all kinds of new titles and new roles that have just never happened in retail before. And again, no two retailers are taking the same approach to that. Also, too, Retail HQ has become a revolving door. And I think any of you who work directly with retailers can attest to that, that sometimes these retail decision makers are changing jobs several times a year, which makes it very difficult to have continuity. But as a result of that, a lot of suppliers are getting in a situation that I call getting lost in transition, because they can find themselves one buyer change away from losing a big business, or in some cases, losing an entire retail relationship. So I think it's very clear that in retail these days, contacts and connections really just don't have the same power that they once did. And if you do have contacts and connections, you may not have them for long. Now, at the same time, I've been saying that there's an alien invasion underway at Retailer HQ as well, and also in many brand companies, as all kinds of folks who are not steeped in traditional ways of retail, whether they're in data analytics, whether they're machine learning experts, whether they're content mavens, they're all flooding into retail right now. And again, completely not traditional retail players or from traditional backgrounds. So this really is good news for those of you who are willing to embrace these aliens. You know, whether you're a retailer who needs a new perspective on your business, you know, being really open to these new folks that are excited about working in the retail space, and particularly on the supplier side, making sure that you're open to these new points of view and these new school players, if you will, because you have to know that those old school tactics that you're used to using with traditional retail team members just aren't going to work with these guys. On top of this, adding to this, clearly the retail world is getting flatter, where those layered structures of buyers, DMs, and GMs and marketing teams that really defined retail for decades are starting to flatten out and even disappear as retailers do morph into becoming these lean, agile technology platforms. And they're also breaking down channel silos between, you know, online and in-store. You've been hearing a lot about it, but what again gets left out of the conversation is how that's impacting their organizations. So you have retailers like Target taking a leadership role. They were actually quite early in unifying their online and brick and mortar businesses under what they call their one inventory approach. Walmart just broke down those same organizational silos in February. So this is an ongoing process of the flattening of these organizations. And this is just really a hint, just the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of all of the changes that are happening at an organizational level. But the great news is navigating all of this has much more to do with how you position what you're already doing than it does jumping into something completely new. All you need is a process for making that happen. And, you know, especially with all of these new stakeholders and new influencers within retail organizations and also within brand companies. But once you nail that process and make sure that you're aligning your sales and your marketing effort with these new retail realities, things become actually so much simpler and clearer to your internal teams and also clearer to your retail partners. And I see it all the time, and it really is a light bulb moment for a lot of companies, you know, when I do my workshops and my master classes. So process definitely makes perfect, and it is about achieving that alignment between those three elements. So we've talked about the organizational revolution. Now it's time to answer some very big questions, like, where's the growth going to come from? Well, it's going to come through diversification primarily, and on two fronts. First of all, business model diversification. Retailers, for example, going into services and solutions, you know, like healthcare and some of these technology and entertainment and media plays that retailers are making, and also brands opening their own stores. So this business model diversification is going to be a much bigger driver than, you know, stores, building more and more stores. And secondly, format expansion. Just about every retailer out there, if you've noticed, even ones that have defined particular models in the past, are now multi-format operators. So-called big box retailers now have small formats, even dollar stores that are very usually very cookie cutter. They're now opening urban concepts. Everybody is a multi-format operator. But the big takeaway is, the big mandate in retail is diversify or die. So business model diversification, format diversification, but also brand diversification. I mean, do you remember when selling in more than one channel was considered completely ridiculous? You couldn't even think about doing it. When brands opening their own stores was just not even a consideration. Well, now keeping a brand locked up in any kind of an exclusive or having a brand tucked away somewhere really can be seen as a ticket to obscurity. Or as I like to say, ubiquity is the new exclusivity. In other words, brands now have the ability and permission to be many places at once. And one of the fastest growing drivers of this ubiquity movement, of course, is online marketplaces. Now, our online marketplaces are really exploding right now, and for good reason. They check a lot of boxes. They can seem like the ultimate productivity play, because through these marketplaces, retailers can basically collect rent on those digital platforms that they've invested so much in, so they're getting a return on their investment through their marketplaces. Also, they can jump into completely new categories practically overnight and do it usually without carrying additional inventory or overtaxing their supply chains. Now, those are some pretty powerful incentives, but I've been talking about the coming marketplace mayhem for a few reasons. Now, first of all, these marketplaces, of course, add a lot of complexity to everything, to the supply chain, to accountabilities, and so on. Also, it means that inventory management is literally a moving target, and it means handing off control. Now, that for retailers, that can mean that those third-party sellers can harm your reputation if they're playing games with pricing or have poor quality or other issues. But the same is true for brand marketers. You know, they're very much beholden to retailers when they're selling on retailers' marketplaces and e-commerce marketplaces like Amazon. They lose a lot of control. And also, in some cases, they are losing that data gathering opportunity as well. And I think, too, we're at a tipping point, because so many retailers right now are selling so many different categories and products on their marketplaces. You have to know that if everybody is carrying the same stuff, then nobody really stands for anything. And it can also be a race to the bottom on price. So I think this is why we're seeing some retailers pull this back a little bit. You know, retailers like Best Buy, for example, are taking a little bit more curated and discriminating approach to their marketplaces. And we're seeing lots of retailers look at that and doing it that way, instead of saying, hey, we've got a platform, just come on and whatever you sell, we'll take it. So they're really getting more attuned to that need to have a point of view. But either way, thanks to all of this digital expansion in its many forms, retailers no longer have to have a store in every major market, because digital can drive the scale. So that's a big takeaway too, because when you hear of retailers closing stores, the knee-jerk impulse is to say, boy, they're in trouble. But the fact is, retailers can address a lot of markets purely digitally or through dark stores and inventory-less pickup formats, going back to that multi-format proposition. But going forward, the general rule of thumb really is going to be to have fewer, more productive stores run by fewer, more productive people. That's retailers' end game, with a few exceptions, looking at those dollar stores and others that are still relying on store growth. But this is going to be the general rule going forward. Okay, one big question frames our next power trajectory, and that is buy, build, or bridge. This is the question on every retailer's mind. Should they make an acquisition? Should they build solutions or brands even internally? Or should they rely on those platform partnerships in order to get ahead and to build up their capabilities? Well, the answer is very clear. It's all of the above. Winning retailers are buying, building, and bridging simultaneously, and this really is going to be the wave of the future. I mean, you look at Walmart, for example, and the explosion in their platform. All of it is a deliberate diversification play, which we just talked about, but it's also being achieved through simultaneous buying, building, and bridging. And they're probably the best example of this out there, although most retailers are getting on board with it. But let's take a closer look at each of these decision points and how they're manifesting. On the buy front, retailers are across the globe making acquisitions as never before. The acquisition activity is just speeding up tremendously. And a lot of the times they don't put out a press release on it. You don't even know that it's happening. But for example, right now you've got Alibaba making a $3 billion bid for a ride-hailing company called Grab. You've got Carrefour trying to expand their footprint even further globally through acquisitions, most recently Welcome in Taiwan. But despite all of the acquisition activity, they are also building capabilities as never before. And this is particularly true from a brand standpoint. Private brands are on the march again. And we've seen this throughout retail history. Private brands have been around for quite a while. But I've been forecasting this latest major private brand push for a few reasons. First of all, going back to that ubiquity, these days national brands have so many options and many are exercising those options. So they're kind of everywhere. And again, that means that price comparisons can be just a click away in the digital space, and that can be a race to the bottom on price. So private brands in this environment become a really powerful differentiator because they blur those comparisons. Now, private brands we know have been highly developed on the global scene for quite some time, with retailers like Aldi and Lidl that are very private brand focused. And in Asia with retailers, Fast Retailing's Uniqlo and others. And here in the US, we're seeing another push toward private brands with big box retailers like Walmart and Target. Now, Target has been particularly aggressive on the private brand front, not only doing away with perfectly successful, in some cases, billion-dollar brands, and just taking a big risk and saying, we're just going to tear these down and build them back up because they've been around for a while and they wanted a refresh, but also layering on new brands constantly. And it's working. Target has not only had an impressive turnaround story before COVID, but they've been navigating the COVID crisis very well, and private brands are a very big part of that success story. But look at Amazon. I mean, as usual, sort of cranking everything up to 11, and this time in the brand space. I mean, how many private brands does Amazon have anyway? 50, 100, 200? Nobody seems to really know because a lot of those brands are not directly associated with the Amazon brand. And by the way, that's intentional because at the end of the day, Amazon's platform really still is its brand, but it's Amazon's ownership of the platform that makes it so armed and dangerous as it builds its brand portfolio. So that's becoming Amazon's real secret sauce: platform plus portfolio, and in some cases doing it on the stealth by just creating all of these brands and not even caring if you know that they are Amazon brands. Now, this of course causes some conflicts with their brand relationships, where brands like Birkenstock, for example, have been saying, you know what, we just don't want to sell on the Amazon platform anymore. Or brands like Nike that are backing away from their relationship with Amazon, but also in general saying, you know what, we're not going to do so much on the wholesale space anymore, even though that's basically how the brand was built. And instead, they're taking ownership and bringing a lot of this back onto their platform. Their thinking is, going back to that platform leverage, why would we empower somebody else's platform when we can empower our own? Opening our own flagship stores, really pumping up our direct-to-consumer business, owning that consumer engagement, owning the data, owning the brand story, making category decisions without having anybody as a middleman. So you're going to see more of this shifting, I think, between buying, building, and bridging, and reevaluating strategies that may have worked in the past, but trying to take more control going forward. But what this means is, in general, for suppliers, diversification in your distribution is really going to be critical, particularly as retailers continue to build up their portfolios. And retailers also, too, it's a time to start looking at that business model diversification and format diversification, whether you do it through buying, building, or bridging. And also, too, remember that private brands are very important to retailers. So if you make them, that's great. If you can support them in some way, that's great. But either way, know that if you are selling brands to retailers, never position your brands as being a replacement to a private brand. always think in terms of being complementary. It really isn't all or nothing. And again, they have a lot of pride of ownership for those private brands. And don't forget private solutions. For those of you who provide solutions and services, your brand doesn't necessarily have to be all over everything. And I see that more with solution providers and service companies for some reason. Know that providing brand options to retailers is a very powerful statement. Whether they want to private brand those, white label them, or if they want to use your brand. But the big takeaway for those of you who work with retailers is if they build it, they want you to use it. So if they built an in-house agency, as increasingly more retailers have, try to tap into it. If they have big data capabilities, the same thing. They're telling me all the time, in fact, I just covered that in my last podcast, we build these capabilities and our suppliers are not taking advantage of them. But of course, that means you have to ask the right questions to even know what they're doing. So stay on top of their platform moves and how you can leverage those. They really do favor suppliers who do that. So bridging, going to our last category, really is the big opportunity, seemingly, because that's when retailers are saying, hey, we're going to turn it over to you. We're not going to buy or build this internally. And they are leaning into bridge relationships as never before, particularly for make or break initiatives like sustainability. Now, sustainability is entering into a second act. It's no longer about just checking boxes and phoning it in. Companies are digging deeper into the supply chain. They're making longer term commitments. They're partnering with companies like ThreadUp and others to participate in the circular economy. So start thinking about how to build those big bridges to these initiatives like sustainability that are where they're getting much more proactive and expansive in their thinking, because it means that they're going to have real staying power. So think about how to build those bridges and do stay on top of how retailers and brands are shifting between these buy, build, and bridge decisions and strategies, because it really does impact the way that you position for opportunities. So I'd like to wrap up by busting one really big myth that you hear all the time in retail, which is that retailers are just scrambling to catch up with consumers and sort of running around with their hair on fire trying to react to what consumers are doing. Revolutionary retailers are actually following a different rule, and it's our final trajectory. And that is that shaping is the new responding. The retailers that have made it this far, thanks to all those tools that are on their platforms now, are in a position to shape consumer behavior, not just to react to it. So I would ask you, how would that change your approach if you own, as a retailer, if you own your ability to shape consumer behavior? But also as a supplier, if you own your power to help them shape consumer behavior, but also to start thinking about this platform positioning and how that's going to allow you to shape your retail destiny and to really shape outcomes with your retail partners. So I'll close with that. And if you have any questions about that or need any help with that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And also, my contact information is on the screen. Reach out with any questions that you want to take offline, any ideas that you'd like to share. And also, too, you'll see a number at the bottom there that you can text retail to that number, and you'll immediately be put on my subscriber list for my retail insights. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Lorcan. I covered a lot of ground there, so hopefully not too overwhelming, but I'm really looking forward to having a discussion.
Carol, that's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
You bet.
And as always, the mind is racing after listening to speak to you. you speaking for sort of 15 minutes or so, and I know we've got a couple of questions coming in on the platform. So again, to remind people, if you do have a question, click on that little question mark symbol on the bottom right hand side, and certainly you can ask those questions there. So I think, Carol, the piece that really stands out for me is this sort of move away from sort of brick and mortar to a platform. And we've seen things like Walmart buying TikTok or being involved with with TikTok and things that that I would look at and say why, and as we look at the platform, it's everything from communications platforms to content to as you sort of said, it's the online, it's the marketplace. But we're also seeing retailers as well looking to take over some more control over supply chain, as in investments in last mile capabilities, all of those pieces. So, if I'm a brand selling into retailer and I'm used to selling into brick and mortar, how does that change? What are the opportunities that are available? Can I, offer to drop ship to some of those online platforms, or how best do I approach this sort of new breed of retailer that's not just about 1,500 stores and locations that we knew where they were previously?
Well, the answer, like a lot of things in retail these days, is it depends.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mainly because I think the big takeaway is that every retailer is taking a different approach. And I think that's been really frustrating for a lot of brands and suppliers, because they're used to things being, sort of monolithic, everybody having the same sort of strategy, the same structure. So the big takeaway is to ask a lot of questions and to stay on top of those platform changes with each retailer, because you can't just say universally, oh, they all want you to drop ship, or they all want you to do this certain thing. It's very important to treat them uniquely and to make sure that your retailer-facing teams are asking really good questions. Hey, what are you guys developing right now? I saw that you just made this acquisition. What do you see as the potential in that? And to really dig deeper into these buy, build, and bridge decisions, because if they've already built it or bought it, they probably don't need you to do it. Right. So really, at the end of the day, you're uncovering where you can build those bridges for them, and not beating your head against a wall and saying, oh, we know that all retailers want this because this one retailer did, and uncovering those unique needs for each retailer. And again, no two will be the same. So it takes a lot of.
Where do you get that information, Carol? Is that just follow what they're saying online? Is it engage with them directly at a buying level, or where do you get that intelligence?
It's all of the above. And the good news is, through this, concept of platform positioning, the more, start with your initial contacts and ask questions about their platform changes. Hey, I noticed that you made this acquisition, or I see that you just built this internal ad agency. How do you want us to tap into that? How can we use that? How can we support this investment that you made? Those are the types of questions with your current contacts, and then actively ask for referrals. Oh, we've got somebody within our organization who is our head of content. Who should she be interfacing with? Those are the types of questions. And then that's how you build what I call influence networks within retailers to start matching up your folks with their folks. And then you become more important to individual retail relationships rather than just relying on that single contact. And you also get a lot of information. So it's an interplay. To answer your question, it's kind of all of the above. It's an interplay between bringing your knowledge and your suppositions to them. We heard about this. Should we be doing something about it? And also drawing them out to tell you what might be on the front burner right now, or what may be in development that could impact your business going forward.
Perfect. And you mentioned fewer productive stores with fewer productive people, or whatever. I think what was a word along those lines. Yeah. So our retailers, a lot of people will say that COVID has accelerated, and I think you mentioned as well a trend towards online, and it's interesting to see some of these notifications that we see store closures and you associate with bad news, and it was interesting to see your perspective of not necessarily. But as retailers are doing this, the brands that are engaging with those retailers are saying, plan A that we had for 2020 has just gone out the window, because retail, a lot of brick and mortar was shuttered. It was like, I describe it with people, it's like sort of water going past a rock in the stream. When the rock appears, the water finds another way to get to the product to the consumer. But how much of what we're seeing are retailers saying, actually, we now have moved forward 10 years in the adoption of online? Are they planning for online to be that larger percentage share of sales going forward? And how are they planning to do that?
Well, I would say that the rush to online is one of the changes that would be permanent.
Okay.
But of course, it's always going to be a matter of degree.
Yep.
Naturally, I think there will be a swing back to brick and mortar when things, let's be optimistic, when things get to a safer place. But the big, the all or nothing part of it is something that I think is unfortunate. Is it going to be bricks or is it going to be clicks? I think what we need to talk about is the underlying drivers. Right now, for example, convenience is a massive movement in retail. And retailers were very focused on convenience before COVID. So it became about building these massive portfolios of convenience options. And everybody was asking, folks in the media were always asking me, hey, Carol, what are they going to settle on? Is it going to be drive up, drive through, deliver to home? It's just all over the place. And the answer is, again, all of the above, because retailers realize that they can't afford to try to corral consumers into solutions or delivery options that are easier or more profitable for them to execute. So they're being placed in a position to have to offer the smart ones anyway, all kinds of different options all at once. And then they have to figure out and do the math at the end of the day on how to make it all work from a profitability standpoint. So the interesting thing, though, is convenience became such a big deal before COVID. Well, those same convenience options are now safety enablers. So it's the same dynamics, but just sort of a different reason why they matter. So that's why I think a lot of these changes are permanent, because they will just go back to being convenient. Right now, they're convenient and safe, primarily safe. Then it's going to go back to what's convenient, and those same options are going to fit that bill.
Sure. Now, anecdotally, we'd have heard of retailers struggling to an extent with e-com, and okay, there's volume there, but can they be profitable at that? With the costs of shipping, and I suppose there's an expectation in the marketplace that shipping is now free. Nobody wants to pay for it, but everybody wants it now within 2 hours or same day or all of those pieces. How are retailers, working through that? Because that also seems to be going just one direction of it's faster and cheaper or free.
Yeah, well, again, the burden's on the retailer to just kind of make that happen. And also, too, I think, in partnership with their brand partners. The big takeaway, though, is that consumers are pretty forgiving if you're upfront about your capabilities and what you can actually execute. The problems come into play when everybody's making promises that they can get something overnight and then it doesn't happen. And I think that's going to be the big challenge going into holiday this year, with this this rush to e-commerce, with everybody having to use the same providers and all of this capacity getting eaten up, and with the season sort of dragging on a little bit longer, thanks to the way that they're organizing their promotions and wanting it to be more spread out. So there's so many variables in play right now, but the main takeaway is to be able to just be upfront about what you can and can't accomplish, and then to carry through with it. And one thing, funny enough, Amazon, the e-commerce platform that never seems to really disappoint anyone that much. I mean, they're pretty much on their game. During the COVID crisis at the beginning, they started prioritizing certain categories, so-called necessities over discretionary categories. Well, of course, that threw suppliers for a loop that provided those discretionary categories. Another example of when they control the platform, it can completely change your world. But also, too, it disappointed a lot of consumers, and it made them start exploring other options outside of Amazon, sometimes for the first time. So I think that's just an example of how that can steamroll if you overpromise and underdeliver.
Yeah,
and
of
I
course,
think that's a big takeaway.
We've all seen the delivery networks even, struggling at a time which is traditionally a quiet time. So this, COVID hit in Q1, Q2, not normally the most busy times when you look at this, and you dial forward to Q3, Q4. And I think, so I think I got some good insight from you there. So you're seeing a more prolonged holiday season, trying to start it earlier, space it out. So physically in stores, you've people spaced out, and online, you've got people spaced out as well. Is that kind of what you expect for this year?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And just kind of trying to keep the heat down. We don't want big rushes of traffic in the stores. We don't want big rushes
Yeah.
necessarily of e-commerce activity. And I thought what was really fascinating this year was, Amazon, of course, starting its Prime Day event when it did, as more of a pre-holiday event. And then to see retailers like Walmart and Target going, well, we're going to ride in their wake and do our big events the same week. So not fun for the supply chain, but
No.
but a decision that they made to say, hey, let's just create a feeding frenzy here during
Sure.
this week, rather than letting Amazon have it all to themselves.
Yep.
But I
And,
wanted to ask
yep,
you a
please go ahead.
question,
Yep.
Lorcan, if I may, because
You absolutely can.
one thing that's been sort of hanging in my mind from the supply chain standpoint is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that up to this point, supply chain has been so much about driving efficiencies. It was efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. But now with all of these variables and unpredictable elements, it seems like it's moving more toward agility.
Yeah.
And that can be more expensive, right?
So,
I mean, what are you seeing in terms of those shifts and the trade-offs
yeah.
between driving efficiency and being able to turn on a dime, and also the cost that might be involved with taking the more agile approach?
No, a good question, Carol. And actually, to be honest, I think what we've seen is, an efficient supply chain loves straight lines. So it loves forecasts that come true. It loves predictions. It likes to have a view into promotional windows so they can plan. And I think what we saw earlier this year is, where you have all of these supply chain signals depending on these wonderful plans. When the plans go out the window, agility is the only game back in town. So I think what you saw a lot of brand supply chain organizations do was actually almost go into disaster recovery mode. And I suppose in many respects, you had a huge manufacturing disruption, a logistics disruption, and a channel disruption all happening at the same time. So valid reason to trigger the plans. And you went back to what's the best data available? What are the decisions? Where do we allocate product? And you went into a sort of an agility to try and at least divert what product was available to the most likely channels that were open to customers. And in some respects, actually, those brands that were less organized possibly did well because they were more used to dealing in an agile space without these perfect plans. But ultimately, I think, what we see is a lot of brands, have coped for the last number of quarters. They're bracing themselves now for whatever is happening in the holiday season and any intelligence that they can get on what's likely to happen. They're looking for all of that intelligence. But then they're also thinking, what are the learnings we take from 2020 and we position those into how we do business going forward?
Yeah.
We had a session with Dave Warwick, who's the head of supply chain with Microsoft a couple of weeks ago. And he basically sort of said, they're realizing some of the power of this agility that they now have and they have discovered and implemented, albeit under possibly less than ideal circumstances. And they want to keep some of that in how they operate going forward. But yeah, some of this will be potentially more expensive. And I think, the things that brands struggle with are, the higher expectation you set with a customer that can have any product at any time within 2 hours, that creates inventory and that creates cost. There's a bigger discussion around, shorter supply chains or a happier supply chain. And should we be, nearshoring or onshoring some of our manufacturing? I think those are discussions that happen all the time and are a bigger discussion for a lot of brands, but I don't think that's going to happen overnight. One other question back, I suppose, to yourself, Carol, is one of the traditional conflict areas between retailers and supply chain providers is the whole area of OTIF and penalties for non-compliance and all of those pieces. And we've seen both Amazon, I think recently, and Walmart increase the level of performance that they expect from suppliers. And I'm not sure if you have any insights into that or into the mindset behind why they're doing that, or are other retailers likely to follow suit, or is it, again, different retailers do things in different ways?
Well, it is different retailers do things in different ways, and they do have different priorities. But right now, this has been, and everything that you just talked about a second ago, it's been a stress test. And to your point, I think a lot of retailers and brands wisely are not treating it as an anomaly. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, let's grab onto this and see how we can carry it forward and be ready for anything, whatever the next thing is, or just operate more efficiently in general. So that's going to trickle down, though, that stress test and that pressure. And it's logically, it gets pushed down to suppliers, and they expect suppliers to jump through all kinds of hoops and really tighten up their games. So more than anything, it's just a case of a lot of these brands and supplier companies needing to mirror the same agility and have that same sense of urgency that retailers do, that of course is being driven by consumers, but also being driven by the retailers themselves. To your point, whenever retailers make a move or Amazon creates this impossibly high bar, everybody else kind of has to follow. They don't have a choice.
No, that's good. I tell you, I know we're coming up close to time, but I have one question I do need to ask you before I let you go, Carol. So you mentioned the amount of private label brands that Amazon have, and private label is definitely not going away. And that really strikes to the heart of a concern many brands have in dealing with these platforms, is that, okay, I'm no longer in control of the customer. And at what point does the intelligence of what products are selling well get converted into a new private label brand strategy for some of those platforms? How do brands protect themselves, short of the Nike or the other ways where we say we disengage with those platforms?
Well, it's difficult. I will say, though, it's been a problem in retail before Amazon. It becomes larger because Amazon does everything with such massive scale. So there were retailers that shall remain nameless that have a reputation actually for years in retail for knocking off their own suppliers. They would bring in a national brand to solidify a category, to get things rolling, and then they would say thank you very much. They would create a knockoff, brand it themselves, and kick out the supplier. That happened quite a bit. So Amazon doing it is, and of course, there's been some legal ramifications even where Amazon is being accused of using a lot of the data that it collects in order to create brands that compete against their own customers. But the big takeaway, again, I have to go back to that diversification, that you have to have diversified distribution. It's really tempting to go all in with some of these big companies and say, wow, we could really make our number with these two accounts. But you've got to diversify your distribution very deliberately. And there are marketplaces and platforms that philosophically don't actually do private brands, or at least at this point, particularly on the global sphere. So not every market, Amazon certainly is creating a lot of brands, but not every marketplace empowers private brands. So that's another consideration too, is to diversify your digital distribution and to do your research and look at some of those marketplaces that are still very much about empowering national brands and about limiting the number of brands that they sell, rather than just taking all comers and saying, hey, we want everybody on our platform.
Sure, I appreciate it. Carol, I could talk to you for hours as always, and really appreciate the insights that you've given us here today. Would like to thank you firstly, obviously, for giving your time and your insights. And we will we'll share your contact details for anybody who wants to follow up. And would certainly recommend, now that we're all sort of going for walks and things like that, there's nothing like a podcast as well to keep that going. So I'd absolutely recommend the podcast as well. Also like to thank everybody else who's joined in for the time. We're just coming up to 50 minutes, so we're a little bit over, but you'll forgive us on this occasion. And thank you all. Wish you a happy and safe rest of your Wednesday. And take care. And again, Carol, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful holiday season, business and every other way.
Perfect. Thank you very much.